Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. My name's Guy Anderson, and I'm the author of Tesla and the Cabbage Patch Kids. And today, the title of my presentation is The Great Repopulation: How Children Rebuilt the World After 1776. So when I say rebuilding civilization, I want you to understand how literal that can be. Because around 1776, which is a year loaded with political revolution, the founding of the Illuminati, the start of New World Order, which we've all seen depicted on the back of the American dollar bill, there was also demographic rupture. The global population stood at around 770 million at the time, but historians now very quietly admit, that between 1776 and 1876, a staggering 3.3 billion people died. So that's not over centuries, that's just over 100 years. And this consisted from war, engineered famines, epidemics, genocide, and the mass displacement of people. Entire towns and cities vanished. Cultures from old empires were dismantled. And yet by 1876, the world population was not that diminished. It had grown to 1.4 billion. That's almost twice the number that existed at the time of the reset. Over 630 million more people, despite, at the same period of time, 3.3 billion deaths. So the arithmetics there don't quite add up. That's 4 billion unaccounted souls introduced within 1 century. You can't reconcile it with natural birth rates. So how did they fill the gap? Children. They filled it with children. What you're about to hear isn't a theory. This is something I've been researching for over 12 years. It's part of the historical records that have been buried, erased, covered up, but it exists. That includes the death of infants, farms that processed them, trains that carried them, fields that housed them, laws that removed them from their mothers, postcards that normalized their fueling of a new world, and incubators that displayed them as commodities. The story begins in 1869 in a tiny cottage called Elm Cottage in Egham, which is in Surrey, in England. A woman named Amelia Dyer, once an ordinary nurse, advertised her care for infants. She called it a service for struggling mothers, but behind the facade, infants were sedated with laudanum. They were starved, strangled, and discarded. The bodies were bundled and dumped into the Thames or buried in shallow, unmarked graves. She was arrested in 1896 after a sack of horribly preserved bodies were discovered. She confessed to 6 murders, but investigations estimated that there being actually between 200 to 400 babies. Spawned largely from poverty, they were unregistered and completely erased. Here's an image of Amelia Dyer now. She's recognised as actually being Britain's most significant serial killer. And she wasn't alone. In Glasgow, 1874, inspectors found babies buried beneath floorboards. In Berlin in 1881, orphanage rooms were filled with laudanum bottles. In Boston in 1887, a woman named Olive Chamberlain was discovered to have murdered 23 infants in her baby farm. Reports across these countries described infant bodies as silenced, processed and discarded, all in the name of convenience and cash. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, a man named Charles Loring Brace sat in New York proposing something grotesque: the orphan train movement. He described children in tenements as scum and the refuge of ill-informed civilizations. I don't know if you want to pop the image up now, Elizabeth, of Charles. From 1854 to 1829, over 250,000 children, most of them not actually orphans, but working class kids and immigrant children, were sent on these trains. They're paraded on display in ceremonies when they get off the train in the Midwest of America, always outside a Masonic lodge. Charles Loring Brace was described as a racist, a very unpleasant man, and the backer that did the PR for the orphan train movement was none other than P.T. Barnum, The Greatest Showman in the World. And it's worth checking on Google, P.T. Barnum's house, and you might think that that couldn't possibly be achieved from just showcasing freaks and circus acts, which is what he made his money from. This house was awarded to him for services. A survivor of the orphan train movement wrote that I knelt in a yard of strangers calling me by my number. They examined us like animals. As I was saying, a very small percentage were actually genuine orphans. It was estimated to be around 9%. The rest were plucked away. Some were abused, beaten, worked to death. One girl adult said, I prayed every night to find my mother. I never did. The stations operated long after Brace's death, fueled by industrial demand for cheap labour. And now we'll have a quick look at some images of the orphan trains. I think there's 2 or 3 of them there. And at the docks of Britain too, quiet but massive export churned. Between 1869 and 1932, 130,000 children, labelled orphans, were sent from Britain to Canada, to Australia, New Zealand and South Africa too. At Fremantle Docks in Australia, there are pictures online showing pale, silent children stepping off ships, no survivors, no officials. They were meant to become farm labourers or household help, but that never happened. A girl later remembered, they said I was lucky. I thought they meant safe. They actually meant useful. Some died, but many lived and never appeared on record. So I just want to pause here for a second, because I need you to feel the silence. Empty docks, long open spaces where children were unloaded and never reconnected to their past. They weren't freed, they were repurposed. And while this industrialisation through children was in full motion, another shift began in public consciousness. In 1896, a film by Alice Guy Blache debuted, The Cabbage Fairy. It portrayed babies sprouting, fully formed from a cabbage. No pain, no labour, a standalone body, a symbol. 1 year later, Martin Cooney opened his incubator exhibits at the World Fairs. Live, premature infants in glass chambers paid admission to view. Guy later claimed credit for the inspiration for her movies from Cooney's exhibition, stating she wasn't inspired, she was actually signalled. And so now what we're going to do is just play you Alice Guy's videos, and I'll tell you a little bit about her in a moment. Just want you to look at how she handles them. Now what's interesting here is that Alice Guy, a year before she made this, was a secretary working at a film studio, and she became, within 12 months, the first female narrated movie star, producer and director. From nowhere. The next video we're going to see is Midwife to the Upper Class, and I'd like you to have a look at how they handle the children in this as well. It's also worth pointing out that Alice Guy gave credit to Martin Cooney for inspiring her to make these films, but the first film was made 9 months before she ever met him or had heard of the incubator babies. Have you spotted that? Now, to me, these aren't being handled like newborn babies. And there he is, paying for the baby. There we go. So the question is, why would the first narrated movie to ever be made by somebody with no experience, that came from nowhere, that also decides to act in them as well, claims that they were inspired to her by the incubator babies at the World's Fairs, yet happened 9 months before the World's Fairs took place? And why would her first video be about retrieving babies from cabbage patches, and the second one go on to be about selling babies from cabbage patches? So in my opinion, these 2 public acts, the films and the exhibitions, were ideological markers. Children could be produced, detached from mothers, commodified for viewing. What happened next merely built on the coded symbolism of this. Between 1900 and 1920, over millions of so-called repopulation postcards were printed across Europe and America. And we might be able to pop a slide up now and we can go through them. You can have a look through them. Okay. Under industrial paper presses, babies were staged in cabbages, wheat, carts, stork nests, captured in things like New Crop, 1904, grown for strength, export quality. And this one's interesting because in amongst the cabbage patches, you can see a pig, a dog, and a monkey as well, all being grown. And these cards weren't artistic. They were government subsidized messaging, sold in maternity clinics, post offices, train stations too. In Chicago in 1912, courts declared them legal but morally loaded. They served as domestic PR, that children are manufactured like produce. And by 1913, the concept had gone further. It became physically possible. Children were being mailed. 4-year-old May Piersdorf shipped 73 miles for 53 cents. 8-month-old James Beagle tagged in a postal box. Newspapers shared images, stamped parcels with human forms. Few protested. And in 1915, Congress ended the practice, but only after hundreds of children had been dispatched. The message was clear. Children can be parcelled like goods. If we click through these images, then we should see, and there they are. In the fields, factories and coal mines, they were already labour units. In Lancashire, 70% of workers in cotton mills were under 14. In Pennsylvania, America, 60% of coal workers were children. Reports show one 10-year-old trapped in a machine fire, the industry continuing as if the incident was just collateral damage. Those children were placed, processed, and replaced. But what about their mothers? While children were converted, mothers disappeared. In 1845, the Lunacy Act in Britain permitted indefinite industrialisation of women labelled unfit. Widows, remarried, grieving, even falling from your horse or having women's problems could get you committed. But what they were trying to do was actually take the children. Because if you lost your husband in battle, you were declared insane. The children became property of the state. And the 1845 Lunacy Act in Britain permitted indefinite institutionalisation, the words out, of women labelled unfit. In Ireland, the Magdalene asylums imprisoned over 30,000 women. Babies were quietly removed from hospitals. Mothers were given no paperwork, no record. And one woman later wrote, "They changed my baby's name before I even had time to cry. Their lives were wiped." And in the colonies, political genocide took place too. So, in Canada, approximately 80,000 Indigenous children were forced into residential schools by the mid-1910s. Mortality rates were 60%. In Australia, 130,000 Aboriginal children were taken between 1869 and 1932 and placed in state custody. Survivors report being tied to chairs if they spoke their languages. They were forced to have their hair cut, to wear uniforms, stripped of their name. And one elder said, "They didn't kill us, they killed our ancestors' language in us." Another said, "I forgot my birth name until my grandmother called me." Now let me speak their voices back to you. Emma, an orphan-trained woman, later wrote, "I knelt each night praying to feel my mother's arms. I never did." William, a home child in Ontario, said, "They called me Farm Kid 24. They told me I was lucky to belong to the Empire, but I belonged nowhere." Anna, a stolen generation survivor, recalled, "I tied my ribbon to trees when I ran away. They took it off and stripped my hair again that night." These were not isolated tragedies. They were systematic erasures, part of a massive hidden program of global repopulation through children, a machinery running on broken biology and erased ancestry. Lily, a Magdalene asylum escapee said. They slapped me if I cried. They sold my child before I could hold her. I was taught not to speak of her. The systems that rebuilt our population were never meant to nurture. They were designed to produce. At the dawn of the 20th century, cloning wasn't a scientific term, but the concept was alive and well in culture. Through repetition, through visual cues, through staged imagery, the public was taught to accept the replication of children, not born from lineage, but grown, staged, and reissued. Let's return to the Cabbage Patch postcards just for a moment. Those cards were more than popular. By 1910, at least 30 independent publishers across Germany, France, and England were producing Cabbage Patch Baby postcards. Stationers in Vienna sold them alongside birth certificates. German toy companies modelled dolls to match the infants in the cards. In France, they were handed out at women's hospitals as gifts. The US caught on. One New York warehouse printed 200,000 cards a quarter, and they were sold next to the adoption centres. What message was repeated in homes, markets and train stations? That babies came from fields. That birth was detached from women. The children were crops. The concept took root in other media too. 1905, children's books in England referenced baby harvest gardens. German kindergarten textbooks included illustrations of nurses pulling infants from roots. The idea of factory reproduction began as fantasy but never stayed there. This was the gradual erasure of natural reproduction, replaced by an artificial generation. And at the centre of the visual normalisation was a familiar name, Xavier Roberts. By 1978, Roberts had launched what would become the Cabbage Patch Kids. But this wasn't just a toy. He claimed to have discovered the babies under a magical cabbage leaf. Children around the world were handed registration certificates for their dolls, fake birth certificates, teaching them that a baby could be issued, not born, from a very early stage. And what makes this even more grim is that if the doll was damaged and returned to the manufacturer for repair, and it was beyond economic viability to do so, the doll was returned to the child with a death certificate. Sounds absurd, doesn't it? Consider this, by the early 1980s, Cabbage Patch Kids were in every major hospital gift shop in the United States. Doctors and nurses normalised them. Children born in maternity wards were sent home holding clones. The conditioning hadn't stopped, it had just changed clothes. Now let's talk about Martin Cooney, the so-called doctor I mentioned earlier on, who displayed premature babies in incubators at World's Fairs from 1897 to the 90s. Crowds paid 25 cents to 70 cents to view rows of struggling infants behind glass. Their tiny arms twitched under artificial light. Their futures were uncertain, but Cooney charged admission and ran the show. Except Cooney wasn't a licensed doctor. Historians now acknowledge he likely forged credentials and never completed medical training, but no one stopped him. He paraded thousands of real infants, many pulled from immigrant wards, many unclaimed by mothers who were told their children had died. Some of these mothers later discovered their babies had been sent to Cooney's slideshow. One former nurse testified in a 1948 interview. We didn't know their real names. The tags only had numbers. When mothers asked, we said the baby was not viable. We'd already wheeled it into the exhibition. So what was this really? Science or spectacle or something darker? A public demonstration that human life could be artificially sustained and controlled by others. Manufactured survival. A saleable miracle. Cooney claimed to save over 6,000 babies, but no federal registry verified this. Many babies left with new names, new parents, and no trace, but money changed hands. There were no follow-up studies, no proof of integration, only rotating exhibits, satisfying audiences, and the legend of a man who exhibited children-like inventions. Let's come back to the women, because in all this talk of repopulation, you must remember mothers were the first to be erased. The Magdalene laundries in Ireland operated into the late 20th century. Girls as young as 12 were locked away for being pregnant, poor, or simply at risk of immorality. Many of them gave birth alone behind convent walls. The babies were removed, sometimes adopted to American families, other times placed into unmarked graves. In 1993, workers at a former laundry site in Dublin uncovered a mass grave of 155 women and children. No names, no records, just bones. In England, the County Asylums Act of 1845 and the Lunacy Act gave local councils authority to institutionalise women for hysteria, controlled grief, legitimate birth, or simply refusing labour. Records show tens of thousands of women incarcerated in asylums throughout the UK by 1890. Many of these institutions, like Bethlehem, better known today as Bedlam, Broadmoor and Rainhill, reported births within their walls. The babies were immediately removed. And those institutions multiplied across the globe. Between 1800 and 1900, over 2,000 orphanages and asylums were built across the US, UK, Canada and Australia. Some publicly funded, others, especially in rural Australia and Quebec, were run by churches, and none were held accountable. Now think about that figure again. Over 2,000 orphanages and asylums were built across the US, UK, Canada and Australia. They weren't. These are repurposed Tartarian buildings. I urge you to look at them online. You do not go to that extent with marble and granite to create an incredible structure to house the very people you no longer want in public. These are death factories. In Quebec, death rates in foundling homes peaked at 70% during the late 1800s. In Toronto, infants from Catholic-run homes were buried in mass graves beyond churches. In Sydney, children from state orphanages were forcibly relocated to the interior to relieve city overcrowding. There are a few records of what happened next. And then there's the stolen generations. In Australia, from 1869 to the 1970s, over 130,000 Aboriginal children were forcibly taken from their families under government orders. Officials claimed it was for their own good. Children were stripped of their names, languages, and tribal identity. Some were placed into white homes, others became servants, and many of them died. In Canada, the Indian residential school system saw more than 150,000 Indigenous children taken from their families. They were beaten for speaking their languages. Some were sexually abused. Many died and were buried in unmarked graves. A 14-year-old Cree girl, speaking in 1996, said, "I forgot my mother's face. I forgot my own name. I remember the straps. I remember blood on my palms." What was this really? A genocide of identity, a total reset. And it was global. This is the new machinery behind the numbers. This is why 3.3 billion people died in just 100 years, and yet the population grew. Children were the raw material of a new world. Their past was removed, their bodies exploited, their minds reprogrammed. And then they were told they belonged to a new civilization. Let me leave you now for a moment with the voice of a man called Jacob, who arrived in Canada on a child migration ship in 1922. He was 8 years old. They told me my parents were dead. They weren't. I found their graves 70 years later, both buried in Liverpool. I was taken, renamed, put in a barn. I worked every day. no school. No one said I mattered. I learned to read by stealing newspaper scraps from the bin. Jacob lived to be 94. No one ever came looking for him. But today we remember him. Let's be absolutely clear. By the time the 20th century was underway, entire nations had been reshaped, not by immigration, not by ordinary birth, but through mass repopulation strategies that left no trace of their sources. And yet there were signs, if you knew where to look. We have the census records, the birth anomalies, and the gaps in the timelines. For instance, between 1850 and 1900, Britain's population nearly doubled, from 21 million to 31 million, despite a fertility rate that was in steep decline by 1880. In Canada, the child population exploded by 400% over the same period, while adult population growth lagged far behind. Similar patterns appeared in New Zealand, Australia, Russia, and large swathes of the United States too, especially in states that had received large numbers of orphan-trained children. But the adult survivors of the pre-17th world, the old world, the Tartarian world, they disappeared. And the children who replaced them, they had no memory of that world, no culture to return to. They were clean slates. Factories needed fingers, colonies needed feet. The world was not rebuilt with thinkers or rulers. It was repopulated with workers, blank, bendable, untraceable. In photo archives from the early 1900s, group shots of cities, mines, and orphanages reveal something eerie: an absence of adults. Entire streets photographed in San Francisco, Liverpool, Hamburg, lined up with children. Some historians say these were school groups. But why? Why were they working? Hauling bricks, sorting coal. One 1903 photo in Pennsylvania shows 18 boys inside a mine with no adult in sight. Where are the adults? We ask that question because the records avoid it systematically, but with intention. Now look to the systems that distributed these children, not just where they came from, but where they were sent. In the United States, from 1900 to 1930, over 1,200 orphanages were in operation. In the UK, nearly 700 children's homes. In Canada, more than 1,000 state-recognised residential schools and homes, not even counting the unlicensed ones. In Australia, state-run children detention institutions, usually religious, received over 100,000 orphans in just 40 years. And almost all of them had a few things in common: high mortality rates, scarce records, high labour output, and the systematic removal of identity. Let's return briefly to the orphans mailed by post. You might think that was an isolated novelty, but in 1913, internal US postal memo from Kansas regional inspectors noted at least 37 male children in a single month. Most were between 6 months and 4 years old. One child sent from Grangeville to Lewiston, Idaho, was mailed with a 15-cent stamp on her back. A rural mail carrier in Kentucky recalled being asked, "Can I send my baby to her grandparents? I don't trust the trains." This wasn't just desperation, it was normalization. Children were now mail items, a shift from soul to commodity. Why were people not more outraged? Because language had changed. The public wasn't told the truth. So let me explain how. In public, governments called them foundlings, home children, state minors, unclaimed youth. In fact, Canada alone labelled over 100,000 children this way between 1869 and 1948. But internally, in the records that did survive, some were simply marked reassigned, rooted, or unaccounted. A child's life reduced to a rail term, their ancestry reduced to paperwork. Now ask, Where did the children go? We have thousands of personal stories, some documented, some passed orally. One woman named Mary Louise relocated from Dublin to Quebec in 1893, and she said, "I never knew I had a sister. She arrived in Nova Scotia. We died before we ever met." A child named Samuel, later interviewed in Sydney in 1965, remembered, "The man told me you were grown in England. Now you belong to Australia. I believed him. I thought I'd actually been planted." And that line, "you were grown," pops up again and again and again. In the World's Fair of 1910 in Brussels, a booth labelled Kinderfledge, child cultivation, ran live exhibits of infants cared for in nursery displays. The babies were rotated hourly. They wore identical clothes, had tags, not names, and Cooney was involved again. Medical Journeys reported that the exhibit as public education, but behind the curtain, private adoption meetings took place, quiet deals, visitors paying to name a child they'd never meet again. Now in London at the World's Fairs, we're told that the babies were on loan from Paris. How did they get them there? These babies were in risk. These babies would have, without the incubators, died. They're premature. Yet they were shipped from Paris to London. And in America, the World's Fairs, children were sent from New York to the various locations by train. At the same time, these incubator babies are becoming a novelty. New Yorker complained that there were too many kids in the city, in fact, too many in America, and they were now overrun. Why would you save the lives of more when you've already got a problem? Now take one more chilling thread. In the British Home Office records, now partially declassified, there's no mention of neutral stock, and then it suddenly appears. A term used in logistics and adoption placements. One file from 1912 lists neutral stock, female, 3.5 kg, no mother contact, ideal for colony integration. We scroll along to the World's Fair in Brussels. There's a colour image there. For anybody that's interested in the World's Fairs, you might be surprised to hear that this one was demolished very quickly after it actually opened, built in under a year. It's the same story for all of them, and you'll find the architect, typically of the World's Fairs, wherever you look, will be in their mid-20s with no previous experience. This is the architecture of the Great Repopulation following the reset in 1776, the end of the Tartarian period, otherwise known as the Old World or the millennial reign of Christ, and the beginning of Satan's little season, better known to you and I as New World Order. Children were manufactured, displayed, distributed, reassigned and erased. That's the Brussels World Fair, 9 months after 9 months after it had opened. The adults who remember the old world, the Tartarian age, the millennial reign, were dispersed of in war, in prisons, in asylums. Their offspring were taken, renamed and redirected. The new children, they had no memory. They didn't speak the old languages. They didn't ask why there were no grandparents. They worked, they obeyed, and when they asked, they were told, "You were found in a cabbage patch." But we remember, because the system never stopped. The maps of orphan trains became the templates for modern adoption grids. The asylum became health centres. The baby farms became private fertility clinics. And the idea that people can be remade from nothing lives on in how we look at migration, surrogacy and policy today. And unless we face it, we're still standing on stolen bones. Now we reach the final arc of this long, horrifying and hidden story. And by now, if you've followed every detail, you know this wasn't just history. It was a full system replacement of humanity, an orchestrated repopulation using orphans and human clones. You heard the death toll. 3.3 billion people dead in just 100 years. You've seen the numbers climb, from 770 million in 1776 to 1.4 billion in 1876, somehow, despite the mass death. You've seen how these new people weren't born in homes. They were raised in baby farms, processed through orphanages, packaged in postcards, displayed in incubators, labelled in shipping crates, and deposited into the world like fresh product. They were not born into family, they were born into purpose. Their purpose was to rebuild the civilization, but without any connection to the one that came before. It was no accident that the first major global movement after the repopulation was the Industrial Revolution. Why? Because children were the workforce. In cotton mills, glass works, coal seams, printing factories, children operated the engines of progress. Their innocence was never preserved. It was consumed. Even the language we use betrays it. The term miner, it doesn't just refer to youth, it comes from the mines. Children sent underground, smaller bodies, smaller lungs, more compliant. You didn't send adults down there. They were too big, too resistant. You sent miners, and they still do. Now consider this. In tens of thousands of images from the late 1800s and early 1900s, entire city streets are filled only with children. Photographs from San Francisco, New York, London, Hamburg, Kiev, Dublin. Where are the adults? You will see 10-year-olds working, eating, building, playing, but rarely a parent in sight. Why? Because the previous generation was gone, because they had been removed. Their children were taken, or they were just not allowed to have them. Asylums and prisons were built faster than housing, if we follow the narrative. Over 1,500 asylums worldwide opened in just 60 years. Rainhill, Bethlehem, Broadmoor, Charrington, Tooting, Longgrove, Mont Park, Danvers, many with sections for women of defective morality. Or in other words, women who questioned, women who cried, women who remembered. They called it hysteria, but what it really was, silence. Engineered silence. And what of the survivors? What about the ones that spoke? We have their stories, and I will close with some of them, because this presentation must end with the truth in the voice of the stolen. Jameson, Canada, aged 84, home child, interviewed in 1912, said, "I arrived with 20 others. I left alone. The farm beat me. I worked barefoot in winter. They said I was lucky. I didn't know what luck meant." In Adelaide, a girl taken to a baby farm in 1878 said, "They wrapped me in newspaper. I was 3. I remember ink. I remember a bell, and not knowing it was for food or punishment." Noel, an Aboriginal elder in Northern Territory in 2004 said, "They took me at 4. My mother screamed until they hit her. I never saw her again. I called myself Boy for 10 years because I didn't know I had a name." Margaret, a former Magdalene inmate in Ireland, said, "They made me scrub blood, not just mine. I heard babies cry and never again. We prayed to sleep, not to wake." One of the nurses from Martin Cooney's exhibition from a testimony, 1948, said, "They were so small. Their mothers were told they had died, but we knew they were alive. Under glass for show, people watched, no one asked." Jacob, a child migrant, buried under a false name in Perth. They said, "You are now. I never felt now. I felt erased." How do you respond to this? How do we respond knowing that much of our modern society, its growth, its expansion, its progress, stands not on innovation, but on the backs of children who never got a life of their own? The answer is memory. We must name them, record them, tell their stories, refuse to let them be footnotes. Because systems like these are never truly dismantled, they're just rebranded. Today they exist as private adoption scandals, mass child migration under aid programs, orphanage tourism, and even commodified surrogacy, selling parenthood without lineage. Still today, there are unmarked graves behind old institutions. in Ireland, in Australia, in Canada, in America, graves of babies who were taken, renamed, assigned numbers, and then buried. And still today, few are held accountable. So we end not with comfort, but with confrontation. This story does not close, it remains open. Until we speak their names, until we find the records, until we dismantle the lies. Because if we do not confront the true history of the population that took place after 1776, if we do not acknowledge the cloning, the postcard propaganda, the mailed infants, the vanished mothers, the erased world, then we are part of the problem. But today, in this story, we're not silent. We are witnesses, and from this point on, we speak for the lost. Thank you very much. Now, if anyone's got any questions, please fire away.
Sorry, I've just kicked Guy off. Let me just get him back on again.
Sorry, I just got kicked out.
Yeah, I know that was me. Sorry, just playing around, pressing buttons.
I thought it was them.
Okay, so we've got, I mean, that honestly, you brought people to tears with that. Yeah, as you say, it's just incredible. What I noticed about those cards was that it was all white skin, red hair, blonde hair. We got to ask the question, has the white skin, is that the clone? Has the white skin been cloned? My pig.
We're long pigs, according to some indigenous tribes, the long pig. Yeah, and to eat human flesh, in their eyes, is an act of cannibalism associated with eating in exactly the same way that eating pork would be.
About Devon, in Devon is the land of pigs, where we both live. They eat a huge amount of pork here. And of course, Devon, I always think, is a very sort of spiritual, enlightened place. Are they sort of doing that to dumb people down, and more of this dumbing down the whole time, trying to bring us, in become heavier and heavier, lower and lower and lower consciousness, because of course cannibalism is very low consciousness. And these are just my sort of questions, but this is what I think of when I look at this. But of course we had the indigenous people in there as well. I think that these are the spiritual people of the land, again trying to bring their consciousness down, dumbing them down. So I'm just reading the questions.
Yeah, if there are any questions. I mean, ultimately, Elizabeth, everything's whitewashed. They whitewashed history, and they repurposed, as we know, all of these old world buildings, the ones that they kept. And of course, they whitewashed the population too. They wanted everybody to believe that the British Empire was responsible for everything good that ever happened, and that the Industrial Revolution lay firmly at the hands of Caucasian men wearing top hats. This is all re-engineered technology from previous civilizations. They've whitewashed the people as well as the history and the buildings too. Right. So have you got any questions there then?
I'm trying to see some. I can't seem to pull out any, questions. Someone's written here, I think when they built the old world buildings, that they started with the tunnels and then they built the buildings up and placed land and mud flood around them.
That's an interesting theory. I actually think that the tunnels weren't tunnels, they were corridors, and the mud floods turned them into tunnels. Because if you look at the logistics of building a tunnel, and a lot of them are red brick, it's very, very difficult. So I think that the mud floods covered corridors that link buildings to buildings, because a lot of the buildings with these corridors, and underneath most major towns and cities, they exist. They have the mud flood windows, one or two at least, lower levels as well. So I believe that the reason we watch them digging on archaeological programs on TV is because there's an awful lot of stuff covered in layers of mud.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. That's an interesting point about them being corridors, definitely. Although I think the tunnels do link up all the cities, don't they?
Yeah, I think they had vacuum tunnels. I think they were using vacuum trains. And I think that's what Musk is talking about when he said he was going to be doing something. I think he's going to reopen a tunnel. And also people suggest that powerful people, beings, whatever you want to call these, that they still use those tunnels. And that's why we never pull up in a traffic jam next to someone very powerful or important, and we don't see pass them on the motorway, see them filling up for fuel.
Yeah, the celebrities and the parasites and all those sorts of people.
Yeah, absolutely. The tunnels are very much alive and well, and they're using them. They're driving down private tunnels. They're using trains in private tunnels, underground routes and subway routes that aren't known to us or accessible to us, still very much alive and well and being used by certain people.
So someone's written here, every time a member of the monarchy goes through a town, it gets whitewashed first. And then someone's written, what do you think is the spiritual purpose of whitewashing if everything has a deeper meaning to it?
There's no spiritual purpose to it. It's the British Empire trying to repopulate with Caucasians and making us believe, and they did this through the World's Fairs, making us believe that indigenous cultures and people from the previous civilization were primitive, and some referred to as savage. And this is whitewashing. They're basically taking the credit for everything that ever was constructed of any significance, anything that ever happened, the entire Industrial Revolution. And look at the inventions that came from Nikola Tesla, Edison, Einstein. These inventions all credited to Caucasian people. These are re-engineered, repurposed tech from previous civilizations, possibly going back all the way to Atlantis. So I think what they've done is they've whitewashed history in favour of Caucasian people under the British Empire. That's what I believe, and that's where the evidence points to.
Okay. It's very interesting. Any difference between the caves and the tunnels?
I think there were caves that were tunnels, and there's a bit of meltology that's occurred. But with regard to the caves linking tunnels together, some will say that the caves are actually what remains of people that survived the Great Flood, the deluge. But also there are people that say that some of these tunnels do link to inner Earth, Agartha, if that's something you're on board with. So the tunnels I'm referring to aren't connected to the caves, that these were superhighways. These were how people moved from place to place, whether they were walking without having to walk with us through corridors, or whether we're looking at vacuum tunnels, or what today are probably used for vehicles to transport certain people around from one place to another quickly. In a similar way, I suppose, to the theory that the tunnels under Disneyland and Disney World are used for the staff to be able to get from one point to another faster. But actually, we've all got a slightly different view on what those tunnels are used for today than we did have, a few years ago. So, I think the caves and the network of the caves have been used for underground civilizations, possibly linking to Agartha, and the underground tunnels are connecting buildings. But I do believe, as I said earlier on, the tunnels that we walk down in towns and cities, I think they were corridors, and they've just been buried, because the logistics of building these kind of things is pointless. It's nonsensical to go to all of that extra effort to link one building to another when it could have just been a corridor.
Yeah. There's some great questions in here. I'm going to download this chat afterwards, and then we can answer some of these questions maybe in another one afterwards.
Well, I realised that I've still got a little bit of time to go, and I finished a bit earlier than I planned.
It's fine, because I think some people will go over. So, we can end here if you want, or there's many.
No, I was going to say, if there's questions, I'm happy to answer questions.
There's a lot of people, I think, asking questions about race and asking about the Tartarians and the Moors. Do you know anything about the Moors in relation to Tartaria? Someone's asking here. And another one asking about Caucasians with red blonde hair, brown hair. Do you think the black race was the superior race?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Moors are probably one of the more significant parts of the Tartarian Empire. And I think that's the confusion. We know that we use Tartaria as a blanket term, but it's not, is it? Tartaria it's a region, it's an expanse of land in the Northern Hemisphere, sort of Asia and Russia. But we use it because although the term doesn't describe the people fully, or the technology, or where they actually had a presence, it's too important a word now for us to let go of. So I think we're all kind of sticking with it. But there were lots of people under that banner. And the previous civilization is really what we're talking about here. And the Moors are responsible for being perhaps the most significant part of that. If you look at what they built as they sort of went from Northern Africa across Europe and Spain, if you look at some of the architecture in Spain, and then over to America, that's the Moors. Anything that's built of significance in any of those places from the old world will be Moorish. And it's perhaps one of the more, as I said earlier on, more important parts of that empire. But of course, the Moguls, Turks and Syrians and so on, lots of people formed that empire. But really, when we say Tartaria, we're talking about an ethos that covered the world. But actually, by definition, it's a particular part of the world, an expanse of land, a region, so to speak.
Okay. I'm just getting messages in the chat. So we've got Levi waiting, but we've still got plenty of time, don't worry. Okay, so there's some questions I'm not bringing up because I'm going to be talking about these things at the end. So someone's saying that they think the tunnels, that maybe it was human civilizations going into hiding inside the excavated caves to avoid the extreme storms above.
Yeah, I think that's what they were warned to do that, weren't they? And so, yeah, I mean, Turkey is somewhere that I'd like to go to have a look there at the caves and the civilization. The sort of, yeah, I would like to go because you and I have spoken about that before. Yeah. And I would like to go there. I think it's a sort of a reddish, the stone's quite a reddish colour there.
Yeah, there's apparently another one in the next city along as well. So there's, it's a massive, massive infrastructure. I mean, it's incredible. But you would think, wouldn't you? Yeah, if there are solar flares and flashes, whatever they're called, you would have to go underground.
Yeah. And they obviously knew they were coming.
Yes, they did. And there's a lot of them. And the indigenous tribes talk about them a lot. There's a lot of them. And of course, the $1 million question is, well, is it orchestrated? Was it orchestrated, or was it just natural disasters? When we're looking at climate and direct energy weapons and things today, we realize that they could do all of this. It's written in the ancient texts as well. So if they were doing it then, of course they're doing it now, these sorts of things. So I know it's a huge, big area.
Yeah.
Okay, so Mr. 76, who's also one of our speakers, what do you think of celebrities being cloned today? Disney having a cloning system, creating their Disney stars. What are your thoughts on that?
The Disney one's strange because I wrote a chapter on that in my latest book, so I don't really want to spoil it. But the Disney one is strange because they do have, I mean, we know there are Disney stars out there like Britney Spears that claim to have been cloned. And then shortly after that, she had a bit of a breakdown. In her music video, she's destroying a cloning center. And one of her songs, she actually repeatedly says, I'm a clone, I'm a clone. So there's obviously, to an extent, you can take these things with a pinch of salt, but not when it comes to Disney. I think that there's something quite sinister going on there. And this all comes really down to the work of someone called Donald Marshall. He's the one that I've been following since 2012. I've been following Donald Marshall, and he's written several books about human cloning, how it takes place, and what they're signing up for. Now, whether or not you believe in human cloning, there's a lot of arguments out there that it can't be done because you can't clone a human being. Yet we can clone a sheep. No one's given a medical reason why there would be a difference. Some people say, but actually it's just ethics. But when did the people in charge ever have that? So that's nonsensical. There's no argument there. If you can clone a sheep, you can clone it. You can clone any other mammal.
Isn't there? The company Clonate
in Canada, who offer to provide that service.
I'd say they clone politicians, celebrities, and people who've lost a loved one, and then want them back again.
Yeah, they'll clone you for numerous reasons. They'll clone because you want another one of you. If you're carrying HIV or same-sex marriages, they will clone. And it's on their website. If you look at services, you fill in a form. They then get someone to call you within a couple of days, and the process starts. So, whether or not you believe that they can or can't clone is going to become harder because the evidence is getting out there more and more. We're seeing it more and more, but this isn't a new thing. If we look at the story in the Bible of a life being created from the rib of another, that's human cloning. The argument there could be, well, it's a metaphor. Okay, it's a metaphor about human cloning. So it doesn't matter whether it took place or was just written about. Someone there has put onto print the process you would go to create another form. And also at the same time consider that the first human, if you like, or Homo sapien was male, and then a female was created. So there's manipulation involved in there to achieve that, because a direct clone of what we call Adam would be another male version of Adam, an identical twin. That all we can say, well, okay, I don't believe the Bible, the story of Adam and Eve, I don't believe that. Well, it's the same story written in the Epic of Gilgamesh. You know, if we look at the story of the Anunnaki creating a slave race to replace the Agigi, then we're talking about cloning again. And this is written in cultures across the world. This is in texts that predate the Bible by 3,000 years. The evidence is out there.
The Anunnaki were cloning. They think they cloned themselves. So that goes back a really, really long way, doesn't it? But also, as I was researching this for my second book as well, which I didn't put a lot of this in the end, but then there was a thing about Lilith. So Lilith is Adam's first wife. And then God was taking 100, said that he would take 100, kill 100 of her babies every day if she didn't return back to Adam. And she refused. And of course, you know, she was able to fly and all these sorts of things, and all that advanced technology that you just think it sounds like myth, but actually it's not. It's magic, advanced technology, how the holographic field works, all these sorts of things. But they do sort of refer to this quite a lot in the old text, don't they? It does seem to be a thing.
Yeah, it does.
So if they were doing it then, they're obviously they're doing it now. Nothing is new.
No, there's nothing new under the sun. And it's so true. And we know now that celebrities have come out and said they've been cloned. It wasn't just Britney Spears, but Kevin Hart sat there and said it. There's quite a few of them. And a rapper called Kid Boo said he'd been cloned. Britney Spears obviously was singing about it. It's become almost in public sight, but to a point where it's normalized. You know, we don't think anything of it. There are so many movies out there about human cloning that we dismiss it. I mean, Star Wars, you know, Attack of the Clones, where we're seeing all of these stormtroopers being cloned. Again, they use the media to show us what they're doing, hiding the truth in plain sight, but it's in such a way that we dismiss it as fiction. And I know we've spoken about this before, and I put a post on Facebook a while ago saying, why do you think these parasites tell us what they're doing? And it's fear of retribution of some sort. But I also think there's pleasure from it. I think that they enjoy rubbing our nose in it. And a lot of people aren't aware that, you know, the symbology is everywhere. In those postcards, if you look online at the Cabbage Baby postcards, then you'll often see that the person growing them looks like he's wearing a very old naval uniform. And this relates to the cabotage laws, part of maritime law and admiralty law, the shipping, the transportation, the trafficking of goods from one place to another. It's all there. Even the last postcard, the image of the last postcard, which showed seeds going in the top and babies coming out the bottom, that's full of Masonic symbology.
No, it's just foul. And you just think of how we used to treat kids, you know, just like 50 years ago, kids were treated so appallingly bad because it had been normalized for the 100 years prior to that.
Yeah, children will be seen and not heard. I mean, I remember that.
Yeah, but the stories that you were bringing out about these people, you know, these actual quotes from people, I mean, it just sounds horrendous. They were treated so appallingly. And the question that I ask is, who went along with that? Like, who were these nurses that were okay with taking babies and telling the mother that they died? They have no heart. Who are these people? I could never say that to somebody, and I don't know any one of my friends who could. So who are these people?
Yeah, so basically you and I would have been sent off to war or sent to prison for not complying, and you would have been committed, sectioned. And I guess they are the people that did comply.
Did comply. So are we thinking about the same thing that happened, you know, 4 years ago here, you know? How many people complied? How many people didn't?
Yeah, yeah. That's ultimately the plan, isn't it? It's a depopulation program again. Having said that, people say that perhaps one of the reasons that this took place was to see who was prepared and ready to move up in a sort of, I suppose, a dimensional way rather than physical. Who's ready for what's next, the fifth dimension, or a reset of things going back to how they were, living with perhaps more connection with our minds rather than greed and possessions, and a stronger connection and bond to the earth and everything on it. There are only so many people that will be attuned to wanting to live like that. So could they be separating? Could that have been a way of separating those that think for themselves freely and question things because they feel something isn't right, separating them from those that are happy to just go along with whatever? Some people would refer to them as NPCs, perhaps, or sheep.
The earth splitting. This is something I've been hearing a lot more, the earth splitting, which is an interesting way of looking at it. But yeah, we're talking about levels of consciousness, aren't we? It's all consciousness. Everything is consciousness.
And I think we'll just have to see what happens, because a big part of me thinks that it was an experiment. It was aimed at depopulation, and they targeted specific groups of people, i.e. the elderly. I hear that the same is going to happen next year, but it's going to be based on something that targets children this time, because it pulls on the heartstrings a bit stronger, allegedly. So that's what I think we've got coming next year. And of course, what we saw recently was the government give pretty much full control to the World Health Organization. I think it was the back end of May. And that takes a year to actually be processed.
I think there are countries backing out of that. There are countries not doing it. And sometimes I feel like we're being pushed into the most extreme scenarios because they want us to wake up. And it's like, how much can we put out there in front of you? How much will you take? You just have to wake up, And I sometimes wonder, because it's so extreme now, and it's just getting ridiculous. I mean, it's just getting ridiculous,
Well, they've come up with this bizarre story about why they're flying planes in the sky that are completely blocking out the sunlight. And a lot of people have fallen for that. And they really do think they're being helped, or that these parasites are doing us some sort of favour. And I don't think that those people can ever be woken. I don't think it matters what happens, what you show them, what you tell them. They'll roll up their sleeve and take whatever's on offer. And I think that that's important, because I don't think everybody is supposed to be woken. I think there are some people that wouldn't be able to cope with the information becoming proven.
Yeah, that's true.
So I don't know. I mean, during 2020, we lived in Northamptonshire, and they were building a super prison at the time in a place called Wellingborough. And I kept wondering if they were going to round everybody up that wouldn't comply. And it's exactly what happened when they reset. In 1776, they rounded all those up that wouldn't comply. They'd got rid of as many as possible through war, 3.3 billion through war, genocide, famine, and natural causes. But, to be able to wipe out over twice the population in 100 years, double the population of the world killed in 100 years, and then at the end of it have doubled the population of what it was 100 years earlier. That requires something rather special, and that isn't natural reproduction. And this time, the fear that I have is that they won't need to repopulate with people. They have AI, they have robotics. They're going to need a very small number of us to do certain tasks for them. So I can see it being reduced to something like 500,000 people across the world.
Well, they need our energy, don't they? A robot isn't going to give them the energy. They are working on putting consciousness into a robot. So consciousness, see the soul. There is a company, 2045.com, who say that they're online for doing that by 2045. I don't think it will happen. I don't see how you can put consciousness inside a robot myself.
No, and whoever's doing that needs to be stopped.
Yes, I know. I mean, like I said, it's getting crazier and crazier and crazier, and you've got to sort of ask yourself, where are we going with all of this? This is just insane.
Yeah, it is. It is. And we're helping them get there. We're perfecting AI for them every time we use things like ChatGPT. We're helping perfect AI. As many of us using it as possible is their aim. And so it's got everybody's information, thoughts, and knowledge, I suppose, on one central database. And I think that that's what they'll use. So the more of us use it, the faster they'll get what they need. But it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because was 2020 a test to see who will comply and who won't, but put in place by the white hats, as they're referred to. Are these the good guys? No,
I see it as a consciousness. I don't see it, as like some bloke, Joe Smith or whatever. It's like it's a consciousness.
Yeah, no, I understand. It's just I would just like someone to name somebody who is involved in that has infiltrated somewhere, that is doing change. I would just like one name, and I won't share it with anybody. But it doesn't seem to be forthcoming.
That's the dragon line. So I talk about them in my second book. So I talk about the different that there's like hundreds of secret societies, and not all of them are bad. So the ones that are more benevolent to society, they're the ones that I see as the white hats. They're people who are behind the scenes, who do not want the world to go in the way that these genocide people want it to go in. But there are hundreds and hundreds of people who are in positions of power who do not want the world to go in the way that the world is currently going. So I see these people as people behind the scenes who are going to be helping in some way. It's not all bad. We're only talking about 1%. The parasitic elites is 1%. There's a lot of people out there who are trying, or who are working on doing good stuff, but they have to do it behind the scenes, because otherwise probably they'll get shot,
Yeah, absolutely.
Some people are playing double roles as well. I do feel this. They're pretending to be bad, but they're doing some, other stuff behind the scenes. But, maybe I'm just living out a movie here.
Well, I think a lot of it's inverted, isn't it? I mean, we know that history is written by the victors, and a lot of people that we would, that we were taught to hate, people throughout history that were seen as barbaric or warmongers. The stories we hear of them are awful, and we've grown up with that. Whether we're talking about Genghis Khan or people in the Second World War, we're told certain people were good and certain people were bad. But it's written by people who actually caused the problems to start with. They're the ones that are writing this information and sharing it. So I think they've inverted so many aspects of our history that it's impossible for us now to know who's good and who's bad. But I think your average person that we would say is an NPC or a sheep or asleep would probably look at what's going on in Ukraine as an act of war at the hands of Russia. But anybody who looks into it would see that actually it was in a situation caused by NATO, and that Russia may well not be the bad guys. I mean, I've seen footage of them raiding bio-weapon facilities and finding literally skips full of dead children. Now, that's not something you're hearing about when you turn the TV on. You're just hearing about what Putin's done this time. And I think that may also be the case with North Korea. I think that we're lied to on a massive scale.
Yes, we are. And that's why I don't think that I think it's a lot more complicated than we are led to believe. I think that anyone who thinks it's all doom and gloom and we're completely fucked, as someone's put on there, I think this is looking at it in a low consciousness way as well.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is. You can't accept that. And because if we stand back and say, okay, there's nothing we can do, it's all gone. It's all gone.
Jump off a cliff.
Yeah, because I think that we're at this point where we've got to be the people that change how things are. And it's like, I keep saying the same thing, that so many people have Stockholm syndrome. They want someone to fix something for them, but the people that they're looking to help them, they want the government to change this, they want the police to start doing that, they want NATO to do this, there's someone better in charge of the World Economic Forum that's on our side. No, this change has to come from you. You know, you've got to be the one that says, I do not need to be told right from wrong. I do not need to participate. I'm going to stand on my own, and I'm going to switch off from everything and no longer be part of what is essentially a corporation, and you are a number. We're more than that. So I think we have to stop complying, stop engaging, turn your TV off, turn the radio off, don't buy the newspaper, don't support huge organisations like perhaps Tesco's. Go to your independent shopping, you know, and just start to walk away and detach ourselves. And next time there's a vote for something, throw it in the bin. They don't care what you've ticked anyway. I mean, they never did. So I think by us participating and arguing over, well, let's get rid of Keir Starmer, he's useless, and let's get the Blues back in, and they'll be useless, and then we'll kick them out, and we'll do that to spite them, and then we'll get the Reds back in because they're now saying things we want to hear. That isn't who runs anything. Exactly. Don't participate. If no one votes, they can't form a government, you know?
I think nobody votes. I think it's only 30% of people that voted on this last one, and they still managed to form a government. So, you know,
I look forward to that. I think people need to know that we're sovereign. You know, we don't need to participate or acknowledge a corporation telling us what to do. And that's why we're issued summonses and demands or penalties. We can't be invoiced or charged for anything by these corporations. That we're not their employees, and we don't have to comply. Ignore them and
turn our back on them. Turn our back on them, because they need our energy. If we all line up with our backs, oh my God, they'll just drop. You know, they're living off us, and unfortunately, we're still giving them our energy. But we need to.
And stop hating people just because they talk differently or look different to you. You know, this is divide and conquer. They want us to fall out with neighbours over religion or even the football team that you support. This has all been done by design. You know, at the end of the day, we're all pretty similar in the dark.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. It was a really a presentation. It was very powerful and very, very moving, because we have to think about all those poor children and how they, you know, how they had no life. And, you know, these were our ancestors. So we need to, we need to amend that. We need to change things for them.
We do. Yeah, we do. And these children that have lost their identity, that needs to be put right. They need to know who they really are, where they're from. They've got a right to know that without having to pay a website to spout out some fiction and give them a family tree. Anyway, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for today. Thank you for putting this together.